Live long and Nanu. Anyway, through the years, people talk about spark testing this, spark testing that, and how to do it properly. Well, it's simpler than you think, but you do have to put a little effort in it. One of my favorites over all the years, this is an L, there you go, L78V. It's a face gap spark plug. What do they call that? They got another fancier term for it, but I remember it as just basically a face gap. This thing works great. It's simple. You don't have to turn your engine over really fast. It makes a good wide spark if it's there. But let's see what we got here. I measured it once, and if I remember, oh heck with it. Okay, let me zero this thing out and get it off of millimeters. Okay, it's zeroed out. And we're in inches. Okay, I'm going to measure that surface gap. That's what they like to call it. Give it a quick, it's kind of hard because, you know, this thing's big and this plug is small. All right, 0.725. Well, let's see if I can, you're going to get it backwards, but that's what it is, 0.725. 725 thousandths is the gap from, you say, well, that's crazy. This is in a Mercury, so plenty of ignition. It's in a Mercury outboard from 1971, I believe. It was a 20 horse, 2-cylinder, and it was one of those that was higher RPM, lower torque. In other words, the power was higher up in the band. I changed the people in the family started mouthing off about it, but I took the 2-blade prop off and put a 3-blade on there. Oh, it was a tractor then. Seriously. We had 2 guys behind it, and they were relatively small, teenage guys, but they were skiing behind the thing. 2 of them. 2. 135, 150 pounds. No problem. It was an animal. They told me, try and hold it back. So I tried to hold it back. It folded everything up against my chest and shot me right up out of the water on my face. So 725 thousandths. The Briggs & Stratton test was 166 at some point, like 200 thousandths. Gives you 10,000 volts. Whatever it was ridiculous. And this one's a very good tester. I've used it many, many, many times. Now, the other one, this is a RJ19LMC, meaning copper core. Standard old-fashioned Champion plug. Standard old-fashioned, equivalent to a CJ8, equivalent to a J8, equivalent to a J17LM. And what was it? About 435, I think, an Autolite. Autolite's a better plug. 10-to-1. But it's not always easy to get them. And you say, well, the old spark plugs used to be ribbed. They were. You know what the ribs are for? The ribs have one purpose. To make the outside surface area further. So if there's going to be a spark, it's going to grab at the ribs and seal better. And the other one is it just makes the surface longer. So if the spark is going to jump and follow a track to ground, it's going to take a lot longer trip. So that's one of the reasons. It's not for cooling. Your spark plug boots over it anyway. Then let's check this one, because I've used these as spark testers as well. What are these? Okay, quick measurement. There we go. You've seen it backwards, but that says 126 thousandths. So let's say 125 thousandths. What's that equivalent to? 1/8 of an inch. From the center, from the side of the electrode, all out. So if I measure from, and that's the sum of the surface gap. If you're measuring from here, up to here, out to the side, that's the air gap that is jumping. So you got 1/8 of an inch there, you're jumping anyway at 125 thousandths. So we got through what was the other one? 720? Oh, the other one wasn't 725. It was 72.5 thousandths. Let me get that straight. There was a 0 in it. So let's just say this is almost 75 thousandths, 0.075. or 0.073 actually. This one is 0.125, much larger gap. What's that mean? Basically, it means a lot more than 10,000 volts is going to take to jump this one compared to this one. And this is a lot more than 10,000. So it gives you a pretty good idea, especially if your magneto is turning over slow. Believe it or not, this is a Champion D21. We use these in a lot of the tractors, gas engine tractors, for many, many years. The other two plugs are 14 millimeter. This one's 18 millimeter thread diameter. What's the gap in space here? Well, if I measure it, I measured this stuff already, so 1.925 is what we're going to go with, or 0.1925. So almost 200 thousandths, just under it, like 1.1925. So what kind of gap? Now, your spark testers that I generally have been buying with Eclipse and the professional type, this is almost the identical gap width. That tells you whether you have enough 20, 30,000 volts to jump a spark plug in a high compression engine. See, what a lot of people don't realize is, yeah, I tested it with this. It gives me a rough idea. I got a good spark. Because this one tonight on my 1960s Solar welder has an Onan CCK engine in it. And I converted it from magneto to battery ignition. While it was cranking over and having a hard time cranking due to, it uses the welder generator end as the starter by backfeeding. It's inefficient. It's 800 to 1,000 pounds as it is. So probably around 8, maybe a little less. They're trying to cut weight. It's copper wound. It's old school. So this gives me an idea when it's cranking over slow, that nice big blue wide spark. That's all I wanted to know. That's all I needed to know. If it was a magneto and spark like that, that would be impressive. Slow speed, fairly wide gap. But if you go to buy an actual spark tester off of Amazon, this is what you're going to have, is something very similar to this. Now, sometimes if you have enough room, you can actually drill into this, and if you have a self-tapping screw, or because you aren't going to be able to get a tap in there, but a small short sheet metal for self-tapping screw, you can put a gator clip on the side of this thing, or have a magnet, put a magnet on there to ground through, hold it in place so you can watch your spark. If it jumps this gap, you got spark. Now, the color of it, over the years, color has been important. They used to actually emphasize color. And what I've been finding out is by the time you get here, the spark is much thinner than it here. So experience tells me if I have a wide blue spark here and a thin blue spark there on exactly the same spark plug wire, what's that tell me? It tells me the exact same story. Just that the short gap is low voltage, higher amperage. It doesn't take as much voltage to jump that gap at 0.073. This gap, 0.19, almost 200 thousandths, a lot more to run that gap. So that's the difference. You're going to see two different blue sparks. That's all there is to it. But they didn't tell me that when I was younger. They tell me that I learned that as I got older. So this one's one that can be used just as well, but this is the final result, especially with a magneto. If you really want to know what your magneto is putting out, make sure you can pull that engine over at about 200 RPM or better, and then see if you can get a good spark out of there, which means take your spark plug out so there's no compression, whirl it over, and check. I'll tell you what your magneto is doing and give you an idea of your magnet, your coil air gap, and your points, how good they are if you have points, or your electronic ignition. This one's just a good check, but it's a nice in-between check. And this one, if you know what you're looking for, is a very good check. You don't have to go whipping the thing over. In the wintertime, this one's great, because it doesn't matter what oil you have in there. It's going to be thick. Well, it's going to turn over slow. This will give you an idea if things are working right. In my case of the battery ignition, all I needed to know was there was spark, and it worked out very well. So hopefully that helps some of you that, when you're looking at someplace 10, 12,000 volts here, but you see a nice big kernel, spark kernel, you know you're in good shape. But when you really want to know what's going on, you want that 0.19, you want that big boy, tell you how much high voltage you actually have. So, and that some people don't believe it, but it is true. When you're running an ignition system, it doesn't matter if it's magneto or battery. Your primary circuit ends up charging the coil you're making a field of a couple hundred volts, 150 to 200 volts, sometimes higher. That's your primary power that you're trying to create. And as your points or your electronic ignition make and break, in other words, they make a magnetic field from the electric current flow, magnetically induced in the magneto, in your battery, that's a couple of hundred volts. But because the volts are going up and down and the field is going up and down, it takes the secondary windings and runs that field by the windings, and that creates your power. So if your points are off, or you're having a problem with the grounding on your magneto, or the magneto is shorted inside, then that field isn't strong enough to create that energy. Your main concern, truthfully, is the primary coil windings in the primary circuit system. Your power coming in to either your electronic ignition coils and such on the primary side is every bit as important or more important than your spark plug, your high spark plug wire, and your high tension side, as they like to call it, or high voltage side. The primary creates the high voltage. So that's why we end up going back, checking points, checking grounds. There was a few rare cases in the past where distributors didn't ground well to the block, and an ohm meter didn't necessarily pick it up, because an ohm meter says, yeah, you got a good connection here, until power starts flying through it. You say power, the energy's coming in, but on the ground side, you need a perfect connection, because your voltage is used up when it jumps that spark gap. So you need it to go back to the block into the battery with almost zero voltage loss, because if everything goes right, you have zero voltage. Volts are used up, your amps do the work, but your amps stay the same. If you took a wire with a light, hook it to battery, plus and minus, and the light's on. If you check on the positive side, get your old inductive meter, or you could do an inline with a light bulb. It'd be easy enough for just a couple of amps. All the way up and down that line, up to the light and all the way back, your amperage is going, or milliamps, depending on what you're reading, it's going to be the same, unless there's severe restriction. The amp flow is the same all the way to ground. Volts, however, going into the bulb, if you have a 12 volt system and your battery is 12.5 volts, well, that's what you're going to have, is 12.5 to the bulb. And then the juice is used up, and on the way back, it's amps, almost 0 volts. So 12.5 going in and coming out might be 0.5, just for enough to answer for your connections. So that's one of the reasons it's important to have the primary side does not have as much of a range to work within as your secondary side does, to be able to make the field from one coil to the other to fire that spark plug. And there's the key to tell you how. Anyway, L78V, J19, J8, J17, CJ8, same gap down here. H10 spark plug even. Same gap there. 216 Autolite is an H10. I forgot what, 456 I think is what the J17LM is. And this one is your D21, which is D23, D16, I think they're occasionally running to a D18. But those larger 18 millimeter plugs, they'll give you the nice, tell you about your voltage. These other two can tell you about your amperage, the bigger the kernel. But this one's going to tell you your volts. All right, time for me to get to bed. You guys have a good night. Hopefully that meant something to somebody. Peace out. Let's see, how do I shut this thing off? Oh, up here. There we go.